Our guest today is author and historian Jeffrey Ryan. His presentation is based on the research for his book, which came out just a few months ago, This Land Was Saved for You and Me, How Gifford Pinchot, Frederick Law Olmsted, and a band of foresters rescued America's public lands. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jeff.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Welcome everyone from chilly but sunny Portland, Maine. It's starting to turn into winter finally. As Jamie mentioned, I have a deep and abiding interest in the history of American conservation, which of course intersects with forest history quite often. I am going to try to, in 30 minutes, highlight three important conservationists that I've found in my search. And I'm going to focus on the question of nature versus nurture. What drove these conservationists to become the forces that they were? Was it more of the world around them? Was it more of their parental guidance or mentorship through other people? Or was it a combination thereof? The first two examples I'm going to give skew one way or the other. And the third, not to divulge too much, but the needle tends to stay in the middle. Just a really quick background. Here are some of the folks that I've been researching lately in my book and other research projects, some of whom you'll undoubtedly notice or know about. So first of all, I just want to give a really quick take on what started me down this path of looking at conservation history. My backyard was a 50-acre nature preserve that was given by a generous man before I was born named Mr. Brown, who I never really knew his first name, but my parents always told me that we should have an appreciation for the generosity that Mr. Brown had for making this resource available to us. So when I got a little bit older, I decided to get out and explore the wider world on my own, no doubt influenced by those early explorations in the backyard and tidal streams. This was me on the Pacific Crest Trail hiking from Mexico to Canada when I was 26 years old. And when I got done with that, I started a 28-year hike of the Appalachian Trail, doing it in sections with the same friend. And that was 1985 to 2013, which basically led me down the path of becoming an author. The first book was Appalachian Odyssey, a 28-year hike on America's trails. And that hike, in addition to other experiences that I had, really led me into the historical part of it. Who were the people that made these lands possible? How did they come about, and what obstacles did they face? Which led me to my first historical dive, which was blazing ahead about the history of the trail. And as Jamie mentioned, my newest book, This Land Was Saved for You and Me. So in looking at this sort of varied history of the pasts of these folks, I really started diving into that sort of balance between nature versus nurture. What made them become the people that they were? Was it more of one or the other? It quite literally led me to travel through the birthplaces and workplaces of these folks in a 1985 Volkswagen van, just to add a little more drama to it. The question of whether you're going to make it there without a part going is always part of the adventure. First example I want to talk about today is Aldo Leopold, who many of us, most of us, I assume, know and love as a conservationist, a wilderness advocate, a naturalist, author, and so much more than that. In the case of Aldo, I really think that it's far more a case of nurture than nature, particularly in the beginning of his life. His father, Carl, was such an amazing influence on his life. He was born in Burlington, Iowa, as I say here. This is his grandfather's and grandmother's house overlooking the Mississippi River. They became affluent through a desk and office furniture company called the Leopold Desk Company. And interestingly enough, their motto says it all as far as I'm concerned, with the Leopold family: built on honor to endure. That was embossed on all of the desks they sold, and was really I think, a sort of mission statement, if you will, for the whole family, a motto. Surely came to pass. As I said, this is the view off their porch. Hard to believe that nature wasn't part of the equation, but when shortly before Aldo was born, his grandparents arranged to have this cottage built behind his grandparents' house. And this is the house that he was born and raised in Burlington. His father, Carl, was a hunting and fishing enthusiast, with a triple star on the enthusiast part of it. Really importantly, from an early age, he taught Aldo that the resource was not inexhaustible. And this is in a time period where market hunting was rampant. Most people were feeling like the resource was inexhaustible. And Carl was making insights that led Aldo to understand that the decisions that we made in terms of conservation were irrevocable in many cases, and at least, or may cause harm in the short term, if not both. So that was really more or less imprinted on young Aldo from an early age. Carl would say things to him like, we shouldn't, even though there's a hunting season in the spring, we shouldn't go in the spring because the fledglings are just coming into existence. Why do we want to kill the parent birds, the mother bird, the father bird? So that kind of imprinting was done on him at a young age. He showed an aptitude for observation. This is his older sister's comment, spending hours cataloging birds and wildlife. So as a teen, he decided he wanted to go to Yale, and the family sent him to the Lawrenceville, New Jersey prep school to get him ready. And I thought this was really telling. So this is 17-year-old Aldo writing home. I'm very sorry that the ducks were slaughtered as usual, but of course you expect nothing else in this time. But when his time comes, he's going to make sure that he tries to change things for the better. And of course he does. In 1909, he had graduated from the Yale Forest School and became assigned to the Southwest. Notably, he married Estella, who was from a vastly different culture and upbringing, which says a lot about Aldo and his approach and what he's willing to learn. And he proposes the first wilderness area, which we all know will come into fruition, but after he leaves as a forester. In 1933, he got a job in Wisconsin, becoming the first professor of game management and directing the arboretum there. The first game management handbook was written by Leopold, so he was the first one to recognize that game should and needed to be managed, given the current state of the depletion of wildlife habitat. And notably, he gives a shout out to his father as the pioneer in sportsmanship inside the cover. Another big step that he took in the 30s, which is often forgotten, is that he was on a project with the state working with farmers to mitigate soil erosion. So he was, again, a champion of watershed management very early on. And then the quintessential moment, he and his family buy the shack and surrounding farmland that will change history, because he puts restoration, land restoration, to the test after he does a little cabin restoration to make it possible for them to hang out there. I love the quote, "The oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it." And I love the shot too of the shack shortly after they purchased it, when he took the family up to see it with stars in his eyes, saying, "Isn't this wonderful?" The story goes that Estella and the kids sort of went along with it, even though it was 2.5 feet deep with fresh chicken manure and needed an entire reboot. But they were on board for it. They planted over 10,000 trees over the next 10 years. Many of them were lost, and they kept going at it. But they wanted to prove the viability of restoring the land. Also, they would go out to railroad tracks and find prairie grass seeds and a few of the remaining wild prairie grasses and bring them back and plant them there. So it was an ongoing project, as we all know. And Aldo, in fact, died of an apparent heart attack while fighting a neighbor's grass fire, which, again, was so Aldo. After he died, a Sand County Almanac came out, which was actually titled by his daughter. He didn't know what the title would be. It sold 2 million copies in 14 languages over the ensuing years. But more importantly, it established the land ethic, the idea that we are all responsible for the land that we live on, not just the wildlands that are being managed, but the ones we live on ourselves. And that conservation is a state of mind between men and land. In terms of the legacy is of his family was also built to endure, just like the family desks. Every one of his children became involved in becoming a naturalist or a defender of the land in some regard, which is really amazing. Not surprising, but such a proud legacy. Estella is still with us, and she is a professor emeritus at University of Wisconsin. So the other thing that came out of it was that his children founded the Aldo Leopold Foundation in 1982. They have people coming to the area of the shack and their headquarters to continue to keep the land ethic alive. As a legacy, there's still the restored prairie in front of the shack, and the Leopold Foundation Center, which, if none of you have gone, it is absolutely fabulous. It's a couple of LEED certified buildings, which actually features some of the beams from the plantings that the Leopold family made and needed to be thinned. They utilized them in the construction of the facility. So another strong legacy for Leopold. So example number 2 in the nature versus nurture is Benton MacKaye. In the case of Benton MacKaye, it is very solidly nature. For a variety of reasons, he was not nurtured much at all. His father, Steele MacKaye, was an enormously creative person who could make and lose fortunes in a split second, seemingly. He came up with ideas like bringing Buffalo Bill to Madison Square Garden and writing a play about it and making fabulous amounts of money, and then losing it on the next big idea. It was, in fact, a financial roller coaster for him. His most audacious and his last scheme was to build a theater called the Spectatorium, which was going to be outside of the gates of the Chicago World's Exposition of 1893. He raised $800,000+ to build this thing, and he had this painting by Hilde Hassam done to promote it, to raise money for it. It was audacious in its size. It was going to have movable stages, and the main stage would feature an 8-foot deep water tank, which would float life-size replicas of the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria. It never got built. That's as far as it got, which is the staging in the back behind I think that's the Iowa State Building. The money got pulled out in a financial panic. He was never able to get it done. It was a tremendous blow to him professionally and personally, and he took it personally. It in fact killed him. He died of basically of the shame that he was not able to pull this off. So in the shadow of the Great World's Fair, one of the greatest spectacles of its era, if not the greatest, it all was for naught. And as a young boy, Benton MacKaye went out there. He was barely 14 years old with his two older brothers, and his father looked up at this scaffolding and failed project and said, you know, this is where it was to be, boys. And was to have been became kind of the mantra of the MacKaye family after that. 5 months later, he died of shame, as I said, a completely broken man, and a 14-year-old boy named Benton MacKaye was left not only without a father, but the fortune was gone, the family fortune, within 6 months. And so here he is living in what the family called a cottage that fortunately one of his older brothers had bought in Shirley, Massachusetts for $100. And ironically and poignantly, MacKaye would live there mostly for the next 80 years of his life. So in the wake of this tragedy, what Benton MacKaye discovered was that nature was in fact the great healer for him. He would go out on what he called expeditions around his home and discovered nature and documented nature to a great degree. It inspired him, it calmed him, it gave him joy at a period in his life where there was not much to be found. This is a book, an anniversary book of his writings, of his childhood explorations around his home, that was put out by the Wilderness Society, I believe on MacKaye's 90th birthday. But in it, you also see that he was a gifted artist, and he was very in tune with what was going on in the environment, a naturalist through and through. He went to Harvard. He graduated in 1900. He didn't like the classes as much as he liked visiting the mountains in between semesters. This is him on a hike in 1900 in southern Vermont, taken by his friend Horace Hildreth. He discovered the mountains of southern Vermont and got above tree line for the first time. He also became a forester. He graduated. He was actually the first graduate of the Harvard Forestry School. And practically as soon as he was hired by Gifford Pinchot to become a forester, he was literally on his way to DC when he was told to turn back and take up a job trying to survey what would become the White Mountains and make a case for the White Mountain National Forest coming into being, which he ended up doing over the next couple of years and was successful at that. And that was followed by 15 years of the Forest Service, but it was never really a great fit for MacKaye. MacKaye was an idea guy, and sometimes his ideas were a little bit too fast and progressive for the bureaucracy that he resided in. So he was best off doing projects like the White Mountains surveying on his own. He was not great in an office environment. And frankly, he wasn't the greatest communicator. He was incredibly smart, but his writing tended to be rather obtuse and not always got to the point. Not great for report writing in the Forest Service. In 1921, he was smacked with a second really awful tragedy in his life. His wife, Betty, committed suicide. It was not entirely unexpectedly, but the situation around it was quite awful. They were trying to get her to a facility a sanitarium to be committed, and she got away from them in the train station and basically committed suicide in the East River. It was an awful thing for MacKaye, obviously, and once again, he found himself needing to turn to nature. And fortunately, a friend of his named Whitaker in New Jersey had a gentleman farm down there and invited Benton to come down to recuperate, which he did. And while he was doing that, about 6 months into it, he had drafted a proposal for a hiking trail that would offer the kind of relief that he had always found in nature, a place to recreate oxygenating, gain perspective, as he said in the article that created and introduced the Appalachian Trail to the world. And importantly, it wasn't just a recreational piece of the pie that he was trying to go after here. He also saw that the trail was a mechanism for getting city dwellers out into the rural environment again. There was an economic aspect to his plan. There were a lot of people escaping the rural environment to go to the cities, and he thought that this was a way to get people back interested in country life again. And also, very importantly, when we look back at it now, he was laying an economic benefit out for the communities where the trail resided. So overnight accommodations, meals, and the building of the trail itself would all provide economic benefits to communities that very much needed them. Very insightful for 1921. But by the 1930s, he found out that people, as he had hoped, were coming from the urban to the rural environment, but not in the way that he had envisioned. Cars were encroaching on wilderness areas in ways that were unprecedented. In fact, Skyline Drive, the first 30 miles or so of it, had been built right over the top of the Appalachian Trail, and MacKaye was appalled and saw where things were going. And he wrote a number of articles against the invasion of automobiles, particularly onto the tops of mountains, which was at the time being proposed for the Green Mountains, the White Mountains, the Massanutten Range in Virginia, and a number of other places, 12 in all. It was horrifying to him. The automobile was, in fact, a negation of the wilderness. It all came to a head for him in 1934 when he was ousted from the organization that he started to create the Appalachian Trail over the question of automobiles. He was trying to get the Appalachian Trail group to disavow automobiles being built on Skyline drives, and they wouldn't go for it. And so he was heading in a different direction and wanted to suggest a different tack for some foresters that he knew. So in 1934, the American Forestry Association meeting, Benton MacKaye, Harvey Broom, Bernard Frank, and Bob Marshall met ultimately on the side of a road in Tennessee. They were getting so animated about the need to create this organization that Harvey Broom's wife almost went off the road. And so they pulled over, or actually, I think it was Bernard Frank's wife, almost went off the road and said they needed to get out of the car and resolve this outside of the automobile, so appropriate for what they were doing. So there on the side of the road, MacKaye said we ought to start an organization that is against Skyline drives. And Bob Marshall very famously said, we shouldn't start an organization which is against anything. We should start an organization that is for something. At which point the Wilderness Society came into being there on the side of the road, at least in concept. This quote here is from the invite that went out to 8 people total, including obviously the 4 that were there. The time has come to recognize the wilderness environment as a serious thing rather than a luxury and plaything. Interestingly enough, to the people listening to us today, is 4 of those people came from forestry. 2 decades of fits and starts with the organization. Marshall and Sterling Yard died. Others are immersed in their own projects, and MacKaye becomes president of the organization. They spent several years playing whack-a-mole with different projects, trying to stop them, predominantly dam projects, notably the Dinosaur National Monument Dam. And so after 13 years of doing this and being exhausted in these one-at-a-time things, MacKaye proposes a nationwide system of statutory protection for wilderness. Takes another 17 years for it to happen, but it finally does, as most of us know, in 1964 with LBJ signing it there into law. So MacKaye died in 75. He was 94 years old. He outlived many of his contemporaries. His cottage still stands in Shirley, Massachusetts. And what's so typical of MacKaye in his understated way, this is his gravestone. You can barely make out the name MacKaye etched into the side of it. It was where it laid naturally in the cemetery. It was very much in keeping with his ethos. But as we all know, his legacy is far more outreaching than that. The Appalachian Trail, for example, over 3 million people walk at least 1 mile a year annually on the trail. And most important for me, and for us probably, is that those who spend longer periods on the trail ultimately become advocates for outdoor recreation and for outdoor space. I'm very much in tune with the AT community, as you might imagine. I go down to an annual gathering every year where they have parades by sort of class year and march down the street. And the people who have been touched by the trail carry a great deal of enthusiasm for our public lands. And there's me after 28 years on the blue shirt there, finishing up. The other legacy, of course, is the Wilderness Act. We now have over 112 million acres of wilderness land designated. So example 3, really quickly, I'll give you is Ernest Oberholtzer, and he is the one more than the others who actually is nature and nurture. Like MacKaye, Ober's youth was punctuated by tragedy. At age 6, his parents divorced. At age 7, his 5-year-old brother dies of a brain inflammation. And his mother goes through an extreme period of grief and daily takes Ober to the cemetery plot where she sits quietly at the gravestone of Ober's younger brother. And just imagine being a 7-year-old boy in a graveyard for hours on end, out with nothing to do. Fortunately, that did not last long. There was a grave digger known only now to us as Burke that took Ober under his wing and took him to explore Duck Creek next to the cemetery, as I show here, and gave a sense of adventure, introduced a sense of adventure into Ernest, even naming one of the islands that they stepped over to Ernest's Island. So, you know, how proud as a 7-year-old boy to have this wonderful place named after him. So Burke gave him an insight into the wonders of nature in proximity to this daily tragedy unfolding in his midst. Larger influence on him was the Mississippi River here in Davenport. Even as a young boy, slightly older than when Burke was entertaining him and introducing him to nature, Ober was wondering, where did those big trees come from that came down the river in barges? He had a yen for going to see those lands where the great trees came from, which is documented, well documented. He goes to Harvard. He graduates from there with a BA. The friendships he made there were at least equal to what he learned in the classrooms, although he spent a lot of time learning about landscape architecture, and actually spends one postgraduate year working for Olmsted in Olmsted's firm office here in Brookline. But it doesn't take long for him to decide he needs to get to Rainy Lake. So by 1909, he sees Rainy Lake for the first time in northern Minnesota and is absolutely gobsmacked and enamored by the place, and takes his first expedition there in a canoe. By 1912, he's back. He gets a job up there, but he also convinces an Ojibwa Indian named Billy McGee, who's 52 and Ober's in his 20s, to go on an amazing canoe exploration, a 2,000-mile trip from where they're at to Hudson's Bay and back. And this is the outline of this expedition. So Ober was, like many young men of his era, really jazzed about going on an expedition to unknown lands. This was largely unmapped territory. The star I show you there is where Billy and Ober built a cairn on a height of land and put a milk can in it with a note to his mother, Ober's mother, Rosa, saying, if they don't make it, this is what happened to them. They were literally on death's door, so they thought. But ultimately, they made Hudson's Bay and made it all the way back before the winter. So by 1922, Ober had been working for a farmer that wanted to develop farmland on various islands in the Rainy Lake watershed, which didn't work out. And when it dissolved, Ober asked to be paid in island land as opposed to cash. So he inherits 3 islands, and the first thing he does is build this writer's cabin, which we see here, which still stands today. He hopes to find a publisher and publish his first book. That falls through. So plan B is building out a homestead on the island. His house, his boathouse, his guest house, and a barge, which was used for lumbering camps, which was now converted into a 4-season kitchen. But the world had other plans other than for him to be writing books. Mallard Island became a gathering spot for his old friends from Harvard and from people of all walks of life, notably the Ojibwa and others around the Rainy Lake watershed for the next 50 years. The big threat came in 1925 when industrialist Edward Bacchus announces that 7 dams are going to be built in the watershed, which is immediately, at least at first, met with glee because of the promise of jobs, until Ober goes around and tells people, do you realize your family cottage is going to be 30 feet underwater? He becomes the face of the Quetico Superior group, which opposes the project, and they become the spearhead for preserving the wilderness and dedicating large swaths of the area as international park, and as we all know, ultimately establishing the Boundary Waters canoe area. In 1957, Ober, this is great, wrote to his Harvard classmates and said, I intended to take the job for a few months. It ended up being 30 years. And also telling about Ober is that all along when Bacchus was being painted as a villain, or the press wanted to have Ober paint him as a villain, he wouldn't take the bait. He was always gracious and always insisted that Mr. Bacchus was a nice man. He just happened to have a different point of view. I thought that that's a really important lesson from all of this. The Ojibwe called Ober Atika-san, which means storyteller. He was not only a lifelong friend of Billy McGee, but he was an honorary member of the Ojibwa tribe. And the friendship continues to this day. The foundation that was founded in Ober's name has board seats that are dedicated to Ojibwa representation. In 1963, Ober wanted to go back and see if he could find the can that was left in case of his death. He always wanted to know what happened to it. And he tapped a young friend, a 25-year-old named Bob Hilke, on the shoulder and convinced him to go back with him and look for it. So they went to Newellton Lake. Ober was 80 years old. And I met with Hilke to talk about the trip. And he said that Ober was absolutely thrilled to find the can. If he was disappointed that the note was no longer in it, it didn't show too much. He was just happy to find it. Everything had come full circle. It was just so important to Ober to get back and be in that place and find it again, which I think is a really great story. So like all of the others we have discussed, a complex man, a man of many interests, lifelong interests that he never let go of. He was the storyteller. He was the chairman of the wilderness effort. He was a scholar. This is just one of the buildings on Ober's Island. He literally had tens of thousands of books. They were about speaking Native American dialect. They were about exploring the world. They were about philosophy. They were about religion. They were about physical fitness. You name it. In fact, you see all those little dots on all the books. They after Ober's death, two librarians came over and basically set up all the books on the island as a library, as a lending library. It is just fabulous. Every building on the island looks very much like this inside. Then there, of course, was Ober the Explorer. This is from his 1912 trip. Haven't talked about this, but he took up the violin at age 3 and never put it down. Took it on all of his trips with him. And finally, Ober the Friend. This is Billy McGee, a couple weeks before he passed. And Ober saw to it that his family was well taken care of. This is a great quote by a woman named Jean Replinger after he died about him living a wonderfully integrated life. He was part of so many worlds, but they were seamless. He unquestionably loved the Ojibwe even at a time when many had little respect for them. And I love this one. He offers a lesson into self-discovery as what to life could really be like. He lived an amazing life and made an amazing impact from an outpost island in northern Minnesota. 75 million acres were directly or indirectly affected by having Ober at the tiller. Ober died on June 6th in 1977. He had not spoken. He was really suffering from dementia the last few years. And very notably, on one of his last outings, he was in a wheelchair on the streets of International Falls. And there was an elder Ojibwa woman on the other side of the street that waved over to Ober, and Ober spoke in Ojibwa to her and laughed, and she laughed and waved. Those were the last words he ever spoke. So on his grave, you see Atika-san on his gravestone in Davenport, Iowa. So to wrap up, I just think it's really interesting to think about how the houses and their environs were so much a part of who these people were. They're really symbolic of the difference they made in the world and their nature versus nurture personalities. So in the case of Leopold, we have story of restoration possibilities, connection, hope, and of course, family. it's amazing to me that the shack, with a little bit of help, is still in pretty great shape today. In MacKaye's case, I think about his home more in terms of the role that it played in stability, familiarity, strength, and comfort. MacKaye was never rich. He always just got by. He was very parsimonious, and the house represented a lot to me, and being there represented a lot. He died in the bedroom that you see on the left that was later added on, but he was there essentially for 80 years. He gave his last interview in 1971 and said, they asked him about the legacy of the Appalachian Trail, and the one thing that he said that really stuck with me was, I hope it doesn't turn into a racetrack. He really wanted people to enjoy the trail at a pace that allowed them to deeply enjoy it, rather than try to do it in, say, 40 days or whatever the record is now. I found that really interesting. And then Ober, when you go to Ober's Island, you just feel this sense of a place that brought so much joy, where so many stories were shared, where the Wilderness Society actually went twice for their annual meeting. How much knowledge and inspiration and energy came out of that place. Really great to stand on the shores of there and feel what Ober felt, or at least partially what Ober felt for the land around him. In short, it's always worth the trip. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope I didn't go over too much.
Thanks, Jeff. No, we're we're fine on time. Just a reminder for folks to submit questions through the Q&A forum. And I'm going to start with Jonathan Putnam, who asks, do you know what the current status of the Oberholtzer Islands and buildings are? And is there anything about climate change and rising lake levels, what impact they may have on these places there?
That is a wonderful question. This last spring, there was unprecedented flooding on the island, and a lot of the structures there were in fact underwater. It was an unprecedentedly rapid snow melt this last year, which we can only imagine was partially climate change to do with. So it was awful, and fortunately everything receded. There was a great effort by volunteers to go out and take care of the damage. First of all, there was a Herculean effort as the waters were rising to save all of the artifacts. Virtually all of them were saved. So what they were dealing with was some buckling floors and some infrastructure below. But fortunately, everything was saved. But the short story is they can still use help financially, because they had to deplete some of their coffers, a great amount, as a matter of fact, to take care of the damage. But fortunately, it's back to where it was, and knock on wood, we will be back in good shape for this season. The property is primarily used for about an 8 to 10 week period in the year, and they have a number of programs. Some are just volunteer trips to help on the island, which I'm sure if you reached out to them, they would be thrilled to have people take part. There are projects like gardening and painting and that kind of thing. And then there's some more construction-oriented projects, painting and collaborating and whatnot. But it's just a fabulous place. I am so honored to have been there twice. I urge everyone to look into getting out there at some point, just not all at once.
You mentioned volunteering to help with some of the restoration work. And I'll just simply say that encourage people that if they want to spend time in some of these landscapes, that's actually a great way of doing it. To not just visit, but to come and immerse yourself, spending time and energy there, and literally walking in the footsteps and working on in the landscape itself. So I would encourage you, whether it's a better known place like this or the Shack, all of these places of historical value need some TLC.
Absolutely.
And, you know, if that's not a reasonable objective or place to get to, be sure to look in your own backyards for trail maintenance and things like that. This is just another way of giving back to what these all of these folks that you talk about in your book have bequeathed to us.
I have a really quick aside too on another aspect of that, which is I've become even a more firm believer in you have to get out and see them in person to get the full effect, because who knew? But I went to see if I could see on a whim. I was more or less in the area within 500 miles and decided to take a side trip into Burlington to see Leopold's birthplace. And I came up and I was looking around and I was taking pictures of his grandparents' place. And there was a guy mowing the lawn out front and he kept looking at me. And I thought, I better get out of here. He's mad at me. And he came right over to me and said, "Can I help you with something?" And I said, "I'm a huge fan of Aldo Leopold." And he said, "Well, you came to the right place. This is my house. And I own this place now, and I'm going to bequeath it back to the foundation when my wife and I pass. But you should know," saying to me, "that they're having a lecture tomorrow morning in Aldo's cottage. And it's the state of Iowa's, I think it was their Forest and Lands or Fish and Wildlife Commission. I can't remember which one, but they were having a lecture the next morning. He said, you should be here at 7:30 and have breakfast with them." And so I went across the Mississippi River and got a campsite and came back. And I was there at 7:30 and the guy came out and said, "Oh, you must be Jeff. Come be an honorary attendee today." And I put my tape recorder on and I got a great insight into his youth that I would not have had if I had not jumped in the van and taken a detour to his birthplace. So there you go.
Hats off to your mechanic keeping that vehicle on the road too.
Yeah.
Leonard Taylor asks, is this the last place you were talking about? Is it also known as the Review Islands?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It's a cluster of islands known as the Review Islands. The main island that Ober lived on is known locally as the Mallard, not Mallard as most of us. It's called the Mallard, which is funny because next to it is Crow, and it's not the Crow, it's just Crow. But anyway, it's one of those localisms. But anyway, the Mallard, and that behind his writing house there that you can see is on the other side of the channel is actually Crow Island. They're tiny islands. And as a really wild aside, there was a local what's the word I'm looking for? A teepee that was built in a nearby recreation area, and it's this giant teepee, and no one knew what to do with it. And so when Ober said he would take it, and they took it down and put it on one of his neighboring islands, and that was, I think, in the 20s or 30s, and that's finally falling apart now. It's just about to go. It's probably going this winter, but pretty interesting.
Okay. We have someone ask, what lessons from your research would help us identify the next conservation thinker today?
Wow.
Yeah, we don't tee up softballs for our presenters here.
You know, I actually think a lot about this, and I believe that the next great conservation thinkers are going to come from groups that are emphasizing being outdoors and getting off the cell phones and tablets and whatnot. And I need to shout out to a local group in Maine called Teens to Trails, and what they're doing is they're working with the state. They have some state funding. They are working to set up outdoor clubs in every high school in the state. It's a partnership between the state education commission and some gear manufacturers that are providing the goods. So they're taking kids out on snowshoeing trips and kayaking trips and hiking trips and canoe trips and you name it. And I really think that you have to love and care about something to become to love and care about the land and waters to become a conservationist. And I think that that's a likely place to look, is imbuing that sense of gratitude and love and not taking it for grantedness in youth is where I think that's going to be fostered. That and great mentoring.
Yeah, and you have to start the pipeline early, if you will, getting people interested in the outdoors. Hopefully then they're interested so much that they'll pursue degrees, which then open other doors. But you don't need a degree to be an advocate for the outdoors. But nevertheless, I'm seeing when I go to Society of American Foresters Convention and other national organizations, the next generation is in school or recently graduated from school, and they're just doing some phenomenal things all over the world.
My first visit to the shack, I drove up and there was a small bus there, and it was the Wisconsin, it was one of the Wisconsin Naturalist Association or something. And they were young rangers and in the state park system. And they had come to see Leopold Shack as part of their schooling, their training. And it was so cool. I was so happy to meet these young people who were really interested in Leopold's story and wanted to know more and more about him. And I thought taking them to the shack was just a wonderful way to introduce them to his legacy. Mm-hmm. I think they went, in fact, I know they went to the foundation right after that to have phase 2 in that classroom. But they were all great, and they were all very enthused about the direction they were headed in. So there is hope.
Yeah, there is. I know in Western North Carolina, there's an organization called something like Muddy Boots. I'm sure there are small local organizations all over. Just like I suggested folks volunteering to do some restoration work, I would encourage people to look in their areas for these youth-focused or youth groups that are helping people, young kids, get out into the woods in one way or another, and volunteering your time, your expertise, your energy, or if none of those are possible, just a donation. These folks, they're small nonprofits. They need help with that. We have a question. Recently, I heard many criticisms of the emphasis on the conservation giants that you talk about, whose ideas are not necessarily original. For example, Leopold's land ethic, already embodied in various indigenous teachings, and they're sometimes overlooked because of the history of colonization in this country. So the question is, what is the appropriate context for appreciating their accomplishments without overstating the novelty of their work?
That is the million-dollar question. I grapple with it every day, and I think the questioner is right on. A lot of these ideas were not original, but the people who are given credit for them, including the three I mentioned, are had been kind of positioned to deliver the message at the right time. As most of this audience probably knows, there were a number of people championing the idea for a national forest before Pinchot came along. It's just that he had the political connections and the right place and time. The timing was right, and other things to make that happen. And it is a very difficult question. I don't want to over glorify the people who made it happen, but the fact that they were there at the right time is an important thing to know, to share. But you're absolutely right. It brings a lot of questions to the fore, not the least of which is how were the lands appropriated? Not the fact that we just need them, but how are they appropriated, and what is the proper response to the way that we appropriated them? There are so many stories about how that was done in an insensitive manner, and you can't really argue with that. So I really don't know what the proper level of attribution is. My purpose in this recent book was to sort of show the importance of those two dynamic handoffs, one from Olmsted to Pinchot. Olmsted made Pinchot's career take off because of the Biltmore, and then Pinchot hiring the foresters who would ultimately come to the realization that, yeah, we need forestry, but we also need wilderness. And so, those two things have become the crux points that were important to me. And so I spun the tale that way. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, and I think to your point, it also depends on what context and how the author or presenter is presenting. Today you were speaking about Leopold and MacKaye, and in your book you talk about others, and it's not as if these folks are parachuted down from the sky with these ideas, these original ideas. There are intellectual antecedents. Historian Rachel Klein presented a few months ago about women in forestry and conservation, and she opened her presentation, which is available on our YouTube channel, talking about Susan Fenimore Cooper and her book Rural Hours, and how she was a few years ahead of Henry David Thoreau and Walden, his book Walden and Walden Pond. In fact, Thoreau cites her book in his. So there are intellectual antecedents, and as historians, that's part of our obligation, is to continue digging into those, and we are. I just, the context and what the topic is does matter.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I think, for lack of a better word, the platform that they had for their ideas matters, because, if you look at George Perkins Marsh with Man and Nature, writing in 1864 about man's effect on the habitat, and that was an incredibly widely read and influential book. Would that have happened if he was not, a person of at least moderate to, if not great wealth, at least a decent amount of wealth? would he have had the platform to get that book published and distributed? Would it have the impact? Would it have enough impact to have reached James Pinchot's desk and have him read it and say, oh my God, my son needs to be a forester? I just think all of those things are really, part of it is right place, right time. And even though other people have been speaking the language or trying to deliver the message, it hasn't always been to receptive audiences.
That's a good point. Chuck Nicholson says, I'm curious about MacKaye's work in planning the Tennessee Valley Authority shortly after its founding in the 1930s. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
I guess really connected to the AT.
I think my recollection off the top of my head is that his TVA experience was very brief. He was in this period of kind of bouncing around agencies for a while, and he was not really finding, talk about not finding a receptive audience. He was always, the way I put it in my book is that it always seemed like MacKaye would seem like he was on the right path, but his declination was a couple of degrees off. And the longer he stayed with an organization, the more they seemed to be drifting apart. And, my recollection off the top of my head with the TVAs, I haven't dug into that recently, is that was one of those assignments that was very brief, and he was trying to figure out, should I even stay in public service anymore? And ultimately, I think he went from TVA to the U.S. Postal Service, which was his last job. It had to do with supply chain issues, like delivering perishables or something like that, and then he left. So I don't think that his work with the TVA was very influential.
Okay, I'm going to share a comment, and then from Edward DiCarlo, and then we're going to finish up with a question from Laura Walls. So Edward says, his comment is, our future natural resource specialists must come from the ranks of urban youth. This is something which that's fair. We often think, so many of these folks that we've been talking about come from more rural areas, but given the size of urban areas and the like, and so he actually has a good question. Do you see a need for highlighting career paths from less traditional backgrounds, which ties to his comment about?
Absolutely. I think that, when I mentioned Teens to Trails trying to be in every high school, one of their big pushes is in urban high schools where, the student body hasn't historically had great mentoring or even opportunities in experiencing the outdoors. So I absolutely agree with you. And I believe that a lot of organizations are putting emphasis on that right now, which is a great thing to see. And I think also really interestingly, as it relates to urban, in the beginning of my book, when I was first trying to figure out the handoff to Pinchot and realizing that it was directly from Olmsted, I started going back in time into Olmsted's career. And Olmsted was, particularly when he was creating, because he is known so much as an urban park designer, which of course he was, he mentions the need for parks and to fill a void in an urban environment of connecting people with nature who otherwise would not have the ability to do so. And he was advocating for that sensibility in Central Park. That's the whole reason behind it for him. The main thrust of it was to provide a healthy outdoor experience to people who otherwise would not get it. And I think that going full circle with that is absolutely the right place to be. In feeling, not just saying we need to have people experience urban parks more, but to serve the urban population and make sure that they have access to meaningful outdoor experiences is the key. As I mentioned before, I've always felt very strongly that we're not going to believe in and pull for and ultimately help rescue places unless we care for them and believe in them. And I go back to my own experience as a child in that nature preserve behind the house. It's a place I love. It's a place I still go to several times a year and check in on it. And it fills me with appreciation for a guy who in 1949 had the wherewithal and the insight to say, here's a suburban piece of land that will otherwise be inundated. I'm going to protect it. In order to have people continue to do that, they have to have that experience. And that's where I'm trying to put some of my effort these days.
Yeah, that's more and more of the studies are showing if you don't get the various groups who don't traditionally go out into nature, if you don't help them connect to nature, they're going to wind up being, I'll just say, indifferent to the need for protecting and managing. It's not just protection, but it's management of these landscapes. So to finish up,
I have one more comment on that.
Sure.
Because when Olmsted was talking about experiencing nature, one of the things he said that continues to resonate with me is, once you have experienced the joy of nature, it's not something that you experience just at that point in time, but now you have the ability to unlock that joy again and again. And that was incredibly insightful for him to be putting it down on paper, I thought, in the 1860s in particular, but insightful anytime. I think that it's that unlocking of joy, the ability to experience it and know that that will be a continuing resource and source of joy and appreciation for the rest of your life. That's what turns people into conservationists.
Laura Walls says, or asks, could you ask if you could say a little more about the role of building and or maintaining a house as it relates to creating a sense of place? Of course, we naturally think of Thoreau and Walden. This seems to be like I would say that in conservation circles, the Leopold shack, they seem to be interconnected around the sense of place as a crucial element in these stories. So she wants to know if you could talk a little bit more about these buildings and creating a sense of place.
Absolutely. So in the case of the shack, what's really interesting to me about that is it was the last building standing. So on this decrepit piece of land that had been over-farmed and was barren. And it was an old chicken coop, and it was 2.5 feet deep in chicken manure when they got there. The walls were falling off. And talk about sense of place and sense of purpose and sense of mission, whatever you want to call it, is for Aldo Leopold to look at that and see a diamond in the rough and say, we can rehabilitate this. It belongs here. And that becomes their family's center point for the next several decades, and point of pride and point of connection with the land. So you have that. And then in MacKaye's case, as I pointed out, it already existed. It was this old, built like a tank colonial house that he happened to inherit. And talk about sense of place. It's a very beautiful village still to this day. Village greens, so the town hall's across the street, the church with a traditional, congregational church with the white spire and all that. I mean, it's all very traditional, which again is in keeping with MacKaye. He was a traditional guy who led a life filled with uncertainty all around him, financial, emotional. That became his rallying point. I feel safe here. I feel stable here. It's no wonder he stayed there for 80 years. The one that kind of splits the difference and really provides a greater sense of place and integration into the environment is Oberholtzer's, because as I mentioned, I don't know if everyone caught it, but he was briefly a landscape architect student with Olmsted himself, and learned an appreciation for melding the buildings into the environment. If you go around the lake and look at the island, there's nothing ostentatious about those buildings. They were all designed to fit in with the island. They all, probably the most ostentatious is the one we're looking at on my screen, which is the writer's cabin there on the point. But the rest of them, they have cedar bark exterior. The cedar bark is vertical. It almost melds into the trees as you go by. It's very understated, and that was part of his training and part of his ethos. It was all very much Ober and in keeping with the environment. He wanted it that way, seamless.
Yeah, you can contrast that with the Pinchot Estate, Gray Towers.
Oh my God.
It's
Yeah, the exact opposite,
It
right?
sits up on a hill, and it's a French chateau that it's a beautiful, beautiful house with gorgeous views, but it is not integrated into the landscape. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for this
Thank you.
presentation.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.